Today we're going to focus on finding the least common multiples of numbers by listing multiples. So our goal is to find the least common multiple of two or more numbers. Your vocabulary words are multiple, common multiple, and least common multiple. And we'll look at the definitions. So a multiple is the product of a number and any non-zero whole number. So multiply by 1, multiply by 2, multiply by 3, multiply by 4, etc. So the multiples of 2, for example, would be 2, 4, 6, 8, 10, 12, 14, 16, 18, 20, etc. A common multiple is a multiple that is shared by two or more numbers. So if you have a common multiple, that means if you have a 6 is a common multiple between 3 and 2, for example. So if they both have that in common, that's 6, that means that that's a common multiple. The least common multiple is the least or the smallest number of the common multiples. And we're going to elaborate on that when we get into the examples. What I want you to do right now is take a minute to pause this video to write down your vocabulary. And if you need to, make sure you go back and write down your goal as well. Go ahead and take a minute to pause now. Let's look at an example. Find the least common multiple of the numbers 5 and 6 by using a list. So we're first going to write out the multiples of 5. So our multiples of 5, of course, are 5 times 1, 5 times 2, 5 times 3, 5 times 4, that's a 0, 5 times 5. So, of course, we have 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, 35, 40, and we can stop there. We can go on further if we need to, but let's start by looking at the 6. So then we have the multiples of 6. So, of course, 6 times 1 is 6, 6 times 2 is 12, 6 times 3, 18, and notice how we're just counting up by multiples. So we have 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, 36, and we notice that hopefully we have a common multiple here of 30. And this is our first one that's common. Our first common multiple is the least common multiple. So make sure you're going back to the greatest common factor tutorials as well and comparing and contrasting the differences. And we're actually going to have another tutorial that does just that, finding the greatest common factor and least common multiple. But it is important that you don't get the two confused. So let me show you a nice typed out multiple. So we look at the multiples of 5 and the multiples of 6. We can see that what we have in common is 30. So the least common multiple of 5 and 6 is 30. In this case, the least common multiple is 5 times 6. So anytime you multiply the two numbers together, that's always going to give you a common multiple, but not always the least common multiple. So that's definitely another thing you want to write down as well. Now, in your notes, if you need a minute to pause, make sure you do that at any time you need to during this video. Let's look at another example. And again, we're going to do this by listing common multiples for this lesson only. Find the least common multiple of the numbers 4 and 8 by using a list. So we're going to start by listing the multiples of 4. We have 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24. And we're going to go ahead and stop there. You can go on further if you need to. Now let's look at the multiples of 8. We have 8, 16, 24, 32, 40. And now we need to look at the least common multiple. Well, looking at the multiples of 4, I can see that 8 is common. I can see that 16 is common. And of course there's going to, and 24 is also common. And I'm going to find a lot of multiples that are common between 4 and 8 because, of course, they have similar factor of 4. So what I need to do now is say, okay, I have so many common multiples in this case, but what's my smallest or the least common multiple? Well, in this case, the least or the smallest one is 8. And let me show you them typed out nice and neat. So my least common multiple between 4 and 8 is 8. And notice how in this case, 8 itself is the least common multiple. Occasionally you are going to come across numbers that share that. So take a minute to pause and make sure your notes are correct and you have all the information you need if necessary. Let's move on. Now we're looking at multiples of more than just two numbers. So what is the least common multiple of 4, 10, and 12? Well, we're first going to list out all of the multiples. And here's a little trick. Look at your highest and your lowest numbers first. So I'm going to model that for you. So let's first look at the multiples of 12. We have 12. And then ask yourself, well, is 12 a multiple of 4? It is. Then ask yourself, well, is it a multiple of 10? No, it's not. So we have to keep going. So we have 24. Notice how 24 is a multiple of 4 as well. However, it doesn't work with 10. And I know from my divisibility rules, which you learned in a previous tutorial, that I'm not going to come across a multiple of 10 until I get to numbers with a 0. So I really need to keep going until I get to something that shares 12 and 10. So this is a way that you can really think critically and look at your numbers critically to help you save time. And remember those divisibility rules because those will help you when finding especially multiple common multiples of numbers. So when you have 2 or more, it's much easier to really look at the numbers and compare them first. So I'm going to start with multiples of 12. Now for modeling purposes, I'm going to list them all, even though I just also modeled a critical thinking strategy for you. So we have 12. We have 24, 36, 48, and we have 60. Now I have the multiples of 10, and I'll do that in a different color for you. We have 10, 20, and again, I noticed that 60, 30, 40, 50, and 60. And if you're thinking critically, you can just say, well, is 60 a multiple of 4? Well, let's list out some multiples of 4. We have 4. Let me do that in a different color too. 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, 28, 32, 36, 40. Again, I notice that's here, but not with all 3. 44, 48, 52, 56, and 60. So I noticed that now I have something in common. I have a 60 here, and a 60 here. And that's my first number that I have in common with all 3. So that means that it is the smallest. And if you're not sure, just look back and say, okay, do I have any that are shared with all 3 before that? No, I do not. So on the next slide, let me show them to you, typed out nice and neat. So notice how I have a 60 in all 3. So my least common multiple between 4, 10, and 12 is 60. So I really want to make sure that you're listing all the multiples in your notes. Even though I modeled a critical thinking strategy, I do want you to make sure that you have your notes complete so that they're easy for you to study. Now I want you to pause the video and check your notes, comparing them with my own. You can see that I have the objective, vocabulary, and the examples so far written out. I, of course, have highlighted important information, and I want you to look at where I've X'd out common mistakes that students make in finding common multiples. Because you can see that we have multiples that are consistent with two numbers, but not all three. The one we have, of course, consistent is 60, that is with all three in the last example. So make sure your notes are complete and take a minute to pause to review them. Now let's look at another example. Find the least common multiple of the numbers by listing the multiples. So we have the numbers 3 and 5. So I'm first going to list the multiples of 3, which of course is 3, 6, 9, 12, 15. And then I'm going to look at the multiples of 5. So I have 5, 10, 15. And I can see that I have 15 is my least common multiple. So my least common multiple of 3 and 5 is 15. And notice that 3 times 5 is 15. Anytime you multiply two numbers together, you'll get a common multiple, but it will not always be your least common multiple. So be careful with that. And hopefully you're noticing a pattern with certain numbers, and that pattern is really going to help you when we find least common multiple in different ways. Let's look at another example. Find the least common multiple of the numbers, again, by listing multiples. So we have the number 12 and 16. So we have the multiples of 12. Well, we have 12, 24, 36, 48, 48 and 60. Now I have the multiples of 16. I have 16, 32, 48, and now I notice that I have my first common one, which is my least common multiple. So my least common multiple, abbreviated LCM, of 12 and 16 is 48. Now I want you to look at the last example. Find the least common multiples of the numbers by listing multiples. We have three numbers. We have 3, 12, and 15. So first you're going to list the multiples, and then you are going to find the least common multiple of the numbers by listing them on your own. Go ahead and pause the video, take a minute, and make sure that you're listing multiples, and then look for patterns. Also, before you even start, you can think about some critical thinking strategies that you can use to find common multiples, especially between the largest and the smallest number. That's always a good place to look. Go ahead and pause the video right now. Now I want you to take another minute to look at your notes to make sure that when you solve the previous answer, your notes look similar to mine. So the last page of notes, we have the least common multiple of 3 and 5, 12 and 16, and then finally 3, 12, and 15 that you did on your own. Make sure you're remembering any keys that represent pieces of information, and go ahead and pause this video to check your notes. So good job on your notes. Make sure that you have all the information you need. Remember, today we listed multiples. We found the least common multiple of numbers by listing multiples. So next time we're going to get into other ways of finding least common multiple. And you can look ahead to other video tutorials that can help you find other ways where you can find least common multiple, especially when you get into larger numbers. So good job achieving your goal today.